Okay, Eisenhower and the Middle East. Okay, in 1951, Iran has a prime minister who is left-leaning. That means he is sort of a communist. He will lean all these American companies in Iran. These oil companies who are drilling for oil, he is going to nationalize all of the oil fields and refineries and take control and kick these companies out. Eisenhower is going to allow Allen Dulles, the CIA head, to eliminate the threat to U.S. oil interests in the region. So the CIA is going to go into the country and they are going to support a coup, a takeover of the country. The U.S. will support the Shah of Iran, which is going to be big problems for us later as time goes on. The Prime Minister accepts help from who? He accepts help from Khrushchev, from the Soviet Union. And so when this left-leaning prime minister gets his support from these guys, we start supporting the Shah. Now the CIA is able to move in and bribe a bunch of the generals and help them to orchestrate a coup, at which point they will take over control of the country and they will install the Shah of Iran as the leader of the country, because he's anti-communist and he's friendly towards us, and he allows these companies to retake possession of their oil holdings in the area. Now, the results of this action back in the 1950s is going to have repercussions all the way through the 70s and the 80s, when the hostage crisis in Iran, when Jimmy Carter is president, is going to be a direct result of the Iranians finally ousting the Shah of Iran and the Ayatollah Khomeini coming back into control. So some of these decisions, many of these decisions, just like the ones from World War I, many of these decisions are going to have far-reaching impact on American foreign policy. Even to this day, our conflicts with Iran can be seen as stemming back to sort of these kinds of activities. Okay. The next thing is it's really a lot more to do with foreign policy, with England and France and Israel and the Egyptians. However, Eisenhower winds up getting involved because of the problem with the chance of the the chance of the communists winding up taking control of the Suez Canal region. Okay. In the 1956, the Suez Canal, lots and lots of stuff gets shipped through the Suez Canal into the Mediterranean, especially oil coming from the Middle East up into Europe. This is where Europe gets most of its oil at this point. Okay, there has been conflict between the Israelis and the Egyptians, Nasser and the Egyptians. And at some point, the Israelis are going to press across this section of the Sinai Peninsula, moving towards the Suez Canal. The French and the British are going to assist the Israelis in this endeavor, because Nasser, who has taken control of the canal, is accepting help from the communists, from the Soviets. So the Soviets are helping the Egyptian government. They take control of the canal in an effort to force all ships coming through to pay a toll so that they can finish building the Answar Dam. The fighting gets fairly significant. Khrushchev starts going on the national scene, international scene, talking about raining down nuclear fire upon all of the nations of Western Europe if they don't stop this. And so it becomes a real mess. Eisenhower has to step in. First, he warns the Soviets that this sort of talk about raining down nuclear fire isn't going to help anything, and any kind of nuclear attack against NATO allies would result in the United States attacking. And so the United States comes in with the mutually assured destruction argument against the Russians. But then the United States, Eisenhower, turns around and chastises the French and the British for involving themselves, getting this heavily involved in this thing. Eisenhower's doctrine is we do support Middle Eastern nations fighting communism, but at this point, Eisenhower has to take the side of the Egyptians, is how it appears. And so this is a real, talk about a quagmire, this is really kind of a problem given what Eisenhower's normal policy is for the region. So the Suez Crisis in from 56 to 58 is it's a point to where we almost wind up going to war again. Now, in Latin America, I don't even know if you can hear, listen if you guys can hear this. Well, first, in Latin America, the United States under Eisenhower's administration, under the guidance of the CIA, Allen Dulles, is going to move to help Central American countries fight against communism. In 1954, we helped to strengthen the forces in the Guatemalan queue, and then in 1959, we helped displace Batista, a dictator in Cuba, with the leader of the Cuban rebels, Fidel Castro. If I'm not mistaken, that's his brother Raúl. Now, the thing about Batista was our guy. We put him into power. During this time period, in the early 1950s, Cuba, especially Havana, is like one of America's playgrounds. It's America's playground south. In the north, there's Atlantic City. Atlantic City, America's playground north. That's where all the casinos and all the showgirls and all the stuff. Down in Havana, you've got the same thing. Casinos, resorts, and things like that. At which point, Batista is going to start taking a hard line. He's going to become much more dictatorial, and the United States is going to recognize that he is no longer supporting our interests. And so when Fidel Castro comes along, a guy who came to this country to play baseball, he becomes very, very famous. A virtual celebrity. As a matter of fact, in this picture, I'm going to talk to my wife. Do you recognize him?
Yeah.
Do you?
Yeah.
Who is it?
Nixon?
No.
Ford?
No.
No, I guess I don't then.
It's Ed Sullivan.
Oh.
The Ed Sullivan Show.
Well, he looks like Nixon and Ford.
Well, he does. They all look the same. All those guys look the same. Old white guys, right? What you've got here is at the end of the Ed Sullivan Show, Ed Sullivan would bring Fidel Castro onto the stage, and he would talk about Latin America's last great hope for freedom, and he would say stuff like that. And what this picture is when the coup, when the overthrowing of Batista is happening. This is night before they invade the presidential palace in Havana. Ed Sullivan goes down to Havana to interview Fidel Castro. I don't know if you can hear it. You can download it on your computers. Turn the volume up.
In Latin American countries over and over again, dictators have come along. How do you propose to end that here in Cuba?
Very easy. Not permitting that any dictatorship come again to rule our country. You can be sure that Batista is or will be the last dictator of Cuba.
you can be sure that Batista is the last dictator of Cuba. That's because Fidel Castro is president for life. So he's not a dictator. He's president for life. Well, the coup is a success. Fidel takes over. And then he asks for loans. And we are offering to give him loans to help him to consolidate his power. Now, the problem is, Allen Dulles, the CIA director, informs Eisenhower that Castro has communists in his entourage, most notably Che Guevara. And so we warn Castro. We tell Castro, listen, you need to clean house. You need to get rid of these radical communists out of your administration. And until you do, we are not going to give you any more support. And so we sort of cut off the loans and cut off the support. Well, this was a problem for Castro. He asked us for loans and we refused. He then tries to buy companies from the Americans at their assessed tax value. There's a lot of these companies, especially the fruit companies, who own a lot of territory, who own a lot of land, but they're not using the land. They just own the land. Now, they pay taxes on the land, but the tax rate is so low on that land that it's really kind of a tax dodge. So Castro says, fine, we'll just take all the land that you're not using and we'll pay you its assessed tax value. Well, the American companies don't like that, but Castro starts doing that. He's also going to start nationalizing the oil refineries that are in Cuba. There are offshore oil drilling going on, and he's going to nationalize those industries, which is basically going to be the thing that cuts us off from him. The reason he does is because someone gives him a tanker full of oil, crude oil, that needs to be refined. Castro takes the oil to the refineries, to these companies, Exxon and Mobil and all of these companies that are in Cuba, and they tell Castro that they've been told by the U.S. government not to facilitate this transaction simply because, number one, he hasn't gotten rid of the communists from his administration, and number two, because of who he got the oil from. Who did he get the oil from? This guy, Nikita Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union. When Castro starts nationalizing these companies, people in Cuba start leaving in droves. Matter of fact, my former pastor was 8 years old when he and his little sister were put on an airplane by his mother and his father and sent to family who lived in Florida. Okay, a few years later, when it was starting to get more difficult to get out of the country, his mother and his older sister were able to escape and get out of Cuba and join Louis and his little sister. And then a few years later, back when it was almost impossible to get out, Louis' dad was one of the boat people. I think the group that Louis' dad escaped with was they had strung together boards and big 55-gallon drums, and they had tried to float and swim their way from Cuba to the Florida Keys. The Eisenhower tells his State Department to cut off ties, and the CIA starts training these refugees. The CIA starts training these refugees because the CIA is already making plans to orchestrate another coup in Cuba and removing Castro at this point. But this time, we've got the added problem of having Khrushchev involved. We've got to be careful not to force the Russians into coming into this thing. Now, Eisenhower in Asia. Eisenhower had promised, one of his campaign promises, I am going to get us out of Cuba. The year after he takes off, when he takes office in 1953, the armistice will be signed. The armistice will be signed, and this line becomes the truce line, which divides North and South Korea today. China and Korea at this point are not our only problems in Asia. This is in China, Korea up here in North Asia. Our big problems at this point in Asia are down here in the south, in Southeast Asia. Okay, it's primarily with the French and the Vietnam. I'll just use this map because I noticed when I was flipping through here, I don't have the map of Vietnam on there. At the end of World War II, the Japanese were in control of not only Korea but also Vietnam. So the Allies, when they accepted the surrender of the Japanese, some of the Allies accepted the surrender in the north. For the Koreans, it was the Russians, and the United States accepted the surrender in the south. For Vietnam, the Chinese were supposed to accept the surrender of North Vietnam, and the British were supposed to accept the surrender from the Japanese in South Vietnam. Okay, the British do in fact accept the surrender of the Japanese troops in South Vietnam, and then they start letting all the French soldiers who had been there during the war, releasing them to help police the South, basically South Vietnam. North Vietnam is now essentially, once the Japanese were deposed, North Vietnam has declared itself independent under Ho Chi Minh. I think we mentioned this, Ho Chi Minh, his Declaration of Independence, which is modeled exactly on the United States. Well, we were so worried about the French becoming communist, that the French are allowed to come back to North Vietnam, and they would accept the surrender of the Japanese in North Vietnam. Okay, for Ho Chi Minh, this was the preferable of the two bad options. Either the Chinese, who've been trying since 406 to get a foothold in Vietnam, or the French, who have been their colonial overlords since the 1800s. Okay, I think Ho Chi Minh's statement was something to the effect, it's better to have to smell French manure for a short time than to have to eat Chinese crap for the rest of our lives. And so it would be easier to deal with the French than it would be with the Chinese. And so the French will be allowed to return. Almost as soon as the French return to North Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh starts the Viet Minh War. The Viet Minh War, fighting in Vietnam between the French and the Viet Minh. I've got a friend whose parents were, this is Korea, his parents were missionaries in northern Vietnam, in the Plateau country, in a place called Pleiku. They worked at a leper colony, a leper hospital. They went to school in one of the larger cities. And he said you could see the Viet Minh, you could identify the Viet Minh because they wore certain kinds of bandanas and a certain kind of hat. And I said, weren't you afraid? He said, no, because I was American. They hated the French. They didn't care about everybody else. They wanted the French gone, and that's what they were focused on. So by 1954, well, I'll talk about all this stuff with, Ho had established his Democratic Republic of Vietnam in 1950. By January, they are recognized by the Chinese Communists and the Soviet Union. May, the United States starts giving aid to the French. We start giving aid to the French. By 1954, the United States is paying for 80% of the cost of the French war in Vietnam. We are literally paying for France's war in Vietnam, and they're not doing a good job. Here's a picture of Ho with the other nationalist groups and the Workers' Party and the other communist elements who were trying to oust the French. We'll talk about them later. But November, this is the big turning point in the French War. The 20th November 1953, the French Foreign Legion is going to land at a place called Dien Bien Phu. Okay, Dien Bien Phu. In Dien Bien Phu, these French paratroopers land in order to rebuild this landing strip in Dien Bien Phu so that they can start bringing materials and supplies in North Vietnam to help fight these North Vietnamese guerrillas. Okay, what you've got in this landing strip, though, all this green area, this is highlands. These are these sort of mountains around this area. This is kind of this valley. So what's going to happen is these guys get landed, and as they're rebuilding the landing strip, every time they get the landing strip built, one plane will land to bring in supplies, and as the second plane is landing, artillery that has been carried up to the tops of these mountains is going to rain down artillery shells on the landing strip where that first and where that second plane are coming, and they start bombing and shelling the dickens out of this landing strip, and everybody has to take off until they destroy it, and then they quit. And the French start trying to rebuild, and as soon as they get it rebuilt and planes start to land, the Vietnamese start shelling and bombing it again. Okay. By 1954, the French are completely defeated at Dien Bien Phu. These guys are starving. They have nothing left to do. And so in July, a treaty is signed, splitting, again, Vietnam into two separate parts. Splitting Vietnam into these two separate parts. The South is going to be led by a guy named Diem. I know it looks like Diem. But it's Diem. That's how it's pronounced. According to this treaty, elections are supposed to be held in 2 years to determine whether Ho's government or Diem's government is going to be allowed to control the country. Okay, Eisenhower immediately starts offering aid to Diem in October. Okay, why does he do that? Well, according to the treaty, the Geneva Accords, he's not supposed to. There's a division at the 17th parallel. No treaties, outside treaties, but with other countries until these territories are stable with a single government. Major powers must stay out. These elections in 2 years are supposed to be held by 1956. An international commission from the UN is supposed to oversee these elections. Canada, Poland, and India are the three countries that are supposed to take care of it. And if you want to, again, you can download when you download the PowerPoint, you can go to this website. This is at Mount Holyoke College. You'll see the Geneva Accords are written out in their document section. For Eisenhower, the problem was North Vietnam is already being supplied by both the Russians and the Chinese. Both the Russians and the Chinese are shipping arms and munitions to North Vietnam, causing South Vietnam to be severely outnumbered and in danger of being quickly overthrown. Okay, now Diem as a person. Diem is not like Ho Chi Minh. He is not personable. A biographer who kind of likes him says he was a short, broadly built man with a round face and a shock of black hair who walked and moved jerkily as if he were on strings, like he was a marionette. And that's a guy who likes him, who's speaking favorably of him. He always dressed in white, which made him look like sort of this ivory tower kind of thing. A single question could get you a 1-hour dissertation for an answer, but if you disagreed with him, the discussion was over, because clearly you don't know what you're talking about. And so he doesn't work well with others. Diem is almost pretty much almost a demagogue. Okay, other problems. In 51, the U.S. approaches the traditional royal ascension to the throne of Bao Dai, who would, the U.S. said, if we put Bao Dai on the leadership with Diem, maybe that would cause the Vietnamese people to trust him more. Okay, most people are going to attack his leadership because Bao Dai spends most of his time in Paris, because as a prince, the Crown Prince of Vietnam, he's pretty much a French playboy. Okay, we are somewhat, the Vietnamese are somewhat wistfully hopeful of Americans intervening. Okay, we're somewhat hopeful of Americans intervening. Dean Acheson, who is still the Secretary of State, says that the problem with Diem, that he is a virulent Francophobe, and this could cause problem. He hates the French as much as Ho Chi Minh hates the French. He's too rigid. He's too Catholic. He's too monkish. He will not make a good leader. Now, we'll go ahead and stop there, and we'll finish up Eisenhower and his trip to Vietnam, or his getting our involved in Vietnam, and we'll see Eisenhower with the Russians, and then it'll be time for you to take your joyous celebration.